Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, you're probably wondering, Iceberg, what happened to your normal intro with the iconic Unicorn Heads tune that we've all come to know and love? And why are you talking like that? Well, that's because in this video I've been challenged by RandomGaminginHD to see who can make the best value gaming PC on a budget of just £200. And to defeat my opponent, the only solution was to become him. What we have here, folks, is a good old-fashioned build-off. The ground rules are that, with our £200 budget, we couldn't simply pick up a pre-built and a graphics card like I did the other week. We could use bundle deals if we wished, but the important part is this had to be a bespoke custom PC, including the main components as well as the case. Operating systems and peripherals are not included in the price, which meant we could squeeze the maximum performance possible from our 4 Alan Turings. We could test whatever games we wanted, but we'd be competing against one another in 5 benchmarks: Cyberpunk 2077, Red Dead Redemption 2, Forza Horizon 5, Cinebench R23 and 3D Mark Time Spy. Starting with the platform, and for a while I was worried that I'd be stuck with one of the millions of H81 boards that seem to be littering eBay. Not that Socket 1150 was bad, but my budget would probably have limited me to an i5, and RDR2 and Cyberpunk are pretty CPU intensive. It doesn't hurt to have a more balanced system, so I moved my search to AliExpress, where I found a Machinist X99 PR9 motherboard for under £40 including import duty. This meant I'd have access to Haswell EP chips with far more than 4 cores, so naturally I jumped at the chance. One sec. It turns out I actually bought the PR8, which only supports 7 obscure China-exclusive Xeons and DDR3 memory. I only realised this fact when I started putting the PC together in the last few days, so rather than reorder a PR9 and delay the video, for the benchmarks I ended up using a Gigabyte X99 board I had to hand instead. For RAM, I bought 4 4GB sticks of DDR4 2133 from my local sex shop for the grand sum of £8, which I also didn't get to use. The Machinist board that I failed to purchase from AliExpress would have run this in dual channel mode, so to avoid the Gigabyte board giving me an unfair quad channel advantage, I've swapped it for a pair of 8GB sticks that I also already had to hand. Although I could have reused one of the cheap Xeons from my recent video on the topic, I chose instead to buy something different, an E5 2680V3 with 12 cores and 24 threads for just £6. Now, as you might expect, this thing was made for servers and workstations, so it doesn't clock all that high. Single core clocks go up to 3.3 GHz, but all core workloads are limited to 2.9. I may have had the headroom to run a turbo unlock mod and at least get it to run at 3.3 on all cores, but I found that the Gigabyte board doesn't work with the mod, so it's actually probably going to run a bit slower. God damn. I picked up this Hyper 212 as part of the Sex Machine back in 2022, and it continues to be a decent performer even for taming a decade-old 12-core CPU. As I broke even on that particular build simply from selling the motherboard's GPU and power supply, it technically didn't cost me anything. However, I've deducted a tenner from my budget total just to be fair. For storage, I bought an OEM Samsung 512GB NVMe SSD for £20 from the same CEX store that I got the RAM from, because even budget builds need solid-state drives in 2024, but it did mean I had to do a fair amount of drive shuffling to test every title featured in the test. The case and power supply were actually the first things I bought, the former being an X-Display Raid Max mid-tower with such modern features as a windowed side panel and ventilation? ? Anyway, it was listed at £20 including delivery, but I got £10 off using a voucher. Buying power supplies on a budget means either buying new and shit or old and potentially f***ed. After a solid day of hunting around, I settled on an FSP Aurum 500-watt unit being sold by what appeared to be a professional PC part shop. It was listed at £30, but I haggled it down to £25. Lastly, the graphics card. I'm somewhat experienced with cheap graphics cards, or at least enough to know that most of the options available under £100 are going to be disappointing. Oh, I know there's exceptions. If I hunted around, I'd probably get a GTX 1060 or maybe even a 1070 and stay under budget, but I felt like an Nvidia GPU might not be the right call for pairing with a lower clocked CPU. On the AMD front, the obvious choice at this price point would be Polaris. However, the obvious choice is no fun. I told myself I could get a Vega 56 for £80 or less on eBay. But, well, I was wrong. Or perhaps just unlucky. I caught the end of an auction on a Vega 56 almost immediately after the challenge began, but the price passed my £80 target and I had to let it slide. Since then, I've had an alert active in the event that another one should show up, but so far it's been mostly faulty units and models with massively overblown buy now prices. Rather than hangle my hopes on a Vega turning up for the right price, I decided to go with the next best thing within my budget, a salvaged RX 5500 8GB from AliExpress, branded Mirzi? Anyway, this one came in at bang on £80, including import fees, and while a fair way short of the Vega in terms of performance, it should handle new titles better than the shady 580s that are doing the rounds. Look out for a full review on this card in the near future. With all that put together, I'm coming in at almost exactly £200, give or take a few pennies. I have a 12-core CPU, 16GB of RAM, an 8GB graphics card on a relatively modern architecture, and all-flash storage. If I wanted to, I could have installed a Linux distro on here and turned this into a console, but there's no way this is going to fit into a living room setup anyway. So I stuck with Windows 10, activated thanks to today's sponsor, you guys. I don't do typical ad spots on my videos, but I do have my Patreon patrons and people who donate via the Super Thanks button who help me afford all this stuff. If you want to join my Patreon, there's a link in the description. There are no tiers, it's just a tip jar effectively, so feel free to pay whatever you wish. Now, enough foreplay. Alright, I don't have the highest hopes, so let's start gently. CS2 isn't exactly CSGO in terms of system requirements, but it's still comparatively lightweight next to some of the other games in this test. At 1080p low, it's a pretty decent experience with an average of 170 FPS. More than enough for my 144Hz monitor, but the 1% lows of 86 are less impressive. I might be tempted to put a frame rate cap on there just to even it out. This is the first time I've tested the rivals on my channel, and I tend to bounce off these things pretty hard. Competitive shooters are one thing, but squad-based co-op type affairs are another thing entirely, and I hate being the worst player in a team. I'm not going to say I hate the rivals, I'm just saying I'd probably need to spend a good few days or weeks of my life getting good at it before I commit to adding it to my roster permanently. 1080 medium manages a decent 71 FPS average, but maybe dropping to low would be for the best, as the 1% are below 60 at these settings. As I want to give both the CPU and GPU a workout, I tested Fortnite in DX12 rather than performance mode, at low settings with TAA and view distance maxed out. Either I'm too accustomed to performance mode, or this game still looks surprisingly good at low settings. Anyway, 95 FPS on average is excellent, and lows of 66 aren't too shabby either, but I suffered a bit of the old Fortnite stutter that you always hope will go away in time, but on the other hand, you might have rage quit by then. It's obviously pure coincidence, but my results in Call of Duty Warzone were weirdly close to those in the rivals. They're not on the same engine or anything, but at 1080p balanced with no upscaling of any kind, I saw an average of 71 FPS and 1% lows of 48. Like with that game, I might be better off playing this one at a lower preset, Though I'll be damned if I'm voluntarily playing a battle royale with resolution scaling enabled. After all that malarkey, it's time to get into the official competitive benchmarks, starting with Cyberpunk. I usually do my own custom test run, but for the sake of directly comparing with Steve's numbers, I've opted for the integrated benchmark instead. 1080p medium is my preferred quality setting, but without upscaling it can only manage 48 FPS on average, with lows of 39. Dropping to low doesn't look quite as bad as I feared, and that actually gives a 60 FPS average, with lows of 44. I always use the built-in benchmark when testing Forza Horizon 5 anyway, because it's a bit more demanding than just driving around Mexico. The game recommended the medium preset, but that seemed a bit overcautious, so I went straight in at 1080 high. The benchmark completed with an average of 77 FPS, with lows of 66, and plenty of VRAM to spare. I'm usually pretty lazy with Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmarking. I just tend to use the main quality slider and let the individual settings fall as they may. But as I know RGNHD tends to use the Digital Foundry console equivalent settings, I did 2 runs, one at the DF settings and one with the slider slap bang in the middle. The latter looked great, but ran poorly, not even managing the magic 50 FPS, and with minimums below 30. The console equivalent settings actually still looked okay, but performed way better. The average went up to over 67 FPS, while minimums were still a bit on the low side. While I didn't particularly set out to make this a repeatable build that anyone could put together, it kinda is. The Xeon CPU, PR9 motherboard and RX 5500 are easy pickups on AliExpress from almost anywhere in the world. If you live in the UK, sex stores seem to be selling off DDR3 and DDR4 dirt cheap, and if you don't have access to cheap sex... If you live in the UK, see it... Fuck's sake. You're a child. If you live in the UK, CEX stores seem to be selling off DDR3 and DDR4 dirt cheap. And if you don't have access to cheap sex RAM, then you can... Grow up, grow up, grow up, grow up. And if you don't have access to cheap sex RAM, you can always look at the bundle deals on AliExpress. SSD pricing appears to be trending back up again, but there are still deals to be had, especially if you're not against buying them second-hand. Used CPU coolers for Socket 2011 V3 don't crop up quite as often as, say, Intel stock coolers, but if you don't have any luck finding one, you can always get a new one on AliExpress or Amazon, and some of the sub-£20 models are apparently pretty good. Cases and power supplies are tricky. I find most people selling used cases don't want to ship them, so if you live in a less densely populated area, or you don't drive, you might find it easier to buy a cheap new case instead. Power supplies suffer from the aforementioned shit-fucked dichotomy, so buying cheap units is something of a gamble either way. Good luck. So, RGNHD and myself haven't exactly talked about this competition much. There hasn't been any pre-game smack talk in which we call each other Muppets and leave a digestive biscuit to dissolve in each other's cups of tea, which is the British equivalent of a slap in the face, in case you were wondering. But I also didn't check in to see if he'd remembered we were doing this, so I hope he's made his video too. Otherwise I'll look like a proper pillock. If he has, it'll be linked on the screen about now, so you can go and watch that, then come back and tell me how much better mine was. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.